So welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone had a good chance to network, which is something we haven't done in so long, networking in person. So this is our final panel of the day. It's called Asian Feminism and the Transnational Women's Movement. And I wanted to explain transnational here means the cross-border movement of ideas, funds, organizing energy, and people. It's not just a synonym for international. So what I'm talking about is movement across borders. We have, things that happen at the international level, but transnational is two-directional. It can be influences going from national up or from international down. And that's the focus of this conversation. The women's movement was one of the first, if not the first, transnational rights movement beginning in the 19th century. It's achieved already so much, from suffrage to the implementation of CEDAW, and now most recently to slowly changing attitudes about gender-based violence. There have been peaks and troughs in the transnational women's movement. So one peak period, in my mind anyway, is the 2 decades from 1975 to 1995, stretching from the first International Women's Year and the first UN World Women's Conference in Mexico City in 1975, which created a lot of impetus for the drafting and passage of CEDAW, and then culminating in 1995 with the fourth UN Women's Conference in Beijing and the production of the Beijing Platform, the Beijing Declaration, which even now remains so influential. So that was a high point for the transnational women's movement. These massive conferences that were held brought together so many governments and also tens of thousands of women activists from around the world. I think the figure in Beijing was something like 30,000 people had gathered in Beijing and in the suburb of Cairo to participate in the NGO forum for the UN Women's Conference. And these gatherings had such a deep impact in terms of networking, creation of a sense of solidarity, recognition of the ways in which problems were similar from country to country and culture to culture. And that national divisions didn't matter necessarily as much as we sometimes thought they were. So these conferences created a huge sense of momentum and energy in what I'm calling the transnational women's movement. And so the question we're going to talk about now is, what is the state of the movement now? How is it surviving the stresses that are roiling the international community? Thinking of the war in Ukraine, the divide, the increasingly hostile divide between the United States and China, the European Union and China, the sense that we are polarizing as we were polarized in the Cold War. Can women still reach across divides to make common cause in addressing shared or similar, if not identical, problems? Is there still room in the international space for the women's movement? The world's attention is focused so much now, and rightly, on the war in Ukraine and the food shortages that have resulted, the energy shortages and the very real hardships that are being felt as direct result, the migration problems. So is there space for the women's movement? We have 4 fantastic speakers today with years of experience working in women's rights organizations on the national, regional, and international levels. And one of these themes that we will explore is the relationship between the domestic and the transnational movement. Before I took my current position at the US Asia Law Institute, I worked in Beijing at the Ford Foundation China office, and we did a lot of work supporting women's organizations and women's rights. And that experience made me very conscious of the tensions that sometimes exist between domestic women's groups and transnational movement over the agenda. As was teed up just now this morning, Vasuki, Professor Nisaya brought up the issue of whether the global north and the international organizations and structures are still setting the agenda. and to what extent the issues that are prioritized and to which the money goes are really the issues that women in all countries care about. So that will be one of our themes. And so I'm particularly happy that our panel straddles those different levels, and we have people here who can speak from all of those different perspectives. So our first speaker is now on screen, is Kyungjin Oh, Executive Director of the Korea Women's Associations United. And she is heroically sitting up in the middle of the night. By now, it's past midnight, to join us. Korea Women's Associations United is an umbrella organization. It has 7 chapters, 27 member organizations, and it's one of South Korea's largest and most influential women's groups. It was founded in the 1980s in the midst of the democratization movement in South Korea. And its many successes include the establishment of a Ministry of Gender Equality, which I think was also mentioned earlier today, which the current Prime Minister is threatening to abolish. And another success is the abolition of the head of family registry system. There are many others. Ms. Oh has been with KWAU since 2016. Before that, she worked with the Korea Women's Political Solidarity, which is one of the member organizations of the larger association. And she's worked with many international development NGOs. Her interests include women's human rights, intergenerational and transnational feminist networks, and gender mainstreaming in international development and peace. So with that, Kyungjin, the floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Kyungjin Oh. I'm a feminist activist based in Seoul, Republic of Korea. Thank you very much for inviting me as a speaker in this meaningful event. My presentation theme is Crossing the Borders, Korean, East Asian, Asian, and the Transnational Feminist Movement. Before going into my presentation, let me briefly introduce my organization that I currently belong to. My organization's name is Korea Women's Associations United, or KWAU. It was founded in 1987, and it is umbrella organization of 7 chapters and 27 member organizations with diverse women's rights across the country. We have been putting a lot of focus on connecting and networking and building solidarities among women's groups at local, national, and Asian international levels. And also, up until now, we have been doing a lot of efforts to utilize the international norms and trends in our own domestic advocacy activities. Okay, sorry, I put so many letters in this small slide. I just wanted to show the feminist movement and political engagement in the Korean experiences. Here, I just wanted to draw a brief picture on how the international norms and trends and the development of law and policy framework in Korea at domestic level, and also the Korean feminist engagement, how these 3 categories have been closely interlinked historically. So when you see here at the national level, we had achieved Korean democratization in 1987, and you see here in the middle, we had 2 consecutive progressive governments from 1998 to 2007 for about 10 years. And you can see there were a lot of big and rapid progress in the legal and policy systems on gender equality. And you can see here at the global level, you may know that there are also a big progress in terms of the development of the international norms and trends. For example, Vienna Human Rights Declaration and Beijing Platform for Action, and the adoption of the gender mainstreaming strategies. So And when you see the left side, you can see the Korean feminist engagement. Um, you can see after 1987, after the Korean democratization movement, there were many progressive women's rights organizations have been established, and they were very, very active in pushing the governments to come up with the policies on women's rights and gender equality. And one of the key advocacy tools that these women's organizations are actively utilized were their international norms, such as CEDAW Convention and Beijing Platform for Action, and these international norms. I don't explain the whole details in this slide, but just want to emphasize that after 2010, we also experienced some pushbacks and regressive trends according to the changes of the governments. But I will just show the current trends in more detail in the next slide. In this slide, I put some key trends in terms of women's rights for the current 3 and 4 years in Korea. And if I summarize the present trend in 2 words of the women's rights situation in Korea, I can say like crisis and Bangladesh. These are not like positive words, but yeah, I have to say that. As you may know that we had a big Me Too movement in Korea 4 years ago in 2018. And this Me Too movement was actually possible because of thousands of young feminist Korean activists, and most of whom are doing like online-based activities. And you see in 2019, the Korean Constitutional Court ruled that the existing law criminalizing abortion is unconstitutional. So therefore, now technically the abortion is not illegal anymore in Korea. However, during the time that there were some big achievements on women's rights in Korea in the recent years, there were also growing trends of the anti-feminist backlashes at the same time. And the current president Yoon Suk-yeol, who took office on this year May, actually when he was doing presidential campaign, he was actively utilizing these anti-feminist backlashes and regressive trends to just get more vote from young men who don't like feminism and women's movement and also women's policies. So his number one pledge was the abolishment of the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family. And now actually this abolishment plan of gender ministry is actually going on. You see, like two weeks ago, the amendment bill on the Government Organization Act that includes the abolishment of the MOJEP, the gender ministry, has been actually submitted to the National Assembly, and it is it has been discussed in the National Assembly. And the divisions in public institutions and budget specifically dedicated to gender equality have been shrinking nowadays in the local governments across the country in this year. And also there have been large-scale monitoring on project subsidies provided to civil society organizations, especially progressive CS organizations in the previous government. And many progressive civil society organizations, including women's rights organizations, have been targeted nowadays. So it's very difficult situation now. And when you see in the school, there are diverse gender equality related terms in school textbooks actually have been being deleted or changed to like family related terms or like very conservative terms nowadays. So these are some like key regressive and backlash trends after the President Yoon Suk-yeol took office in this year, May. And here on the left side, I also put some regressive trends that can have some interrelationships between with the Korean domestic trends and Asia and also international levels. We witnessed that in many Asian countries in the recent years, there have been like democracy crisis and the oppression of women activists, especially like Hong Kong, Myanmar, and the Philippines in like many Asian countries. And also we had a global pandemic, and this global pandemic actually has deepened social and economic inequalities in all parts of the country maybe, and also made women's life more deteriorated. And also there was a US Supreme Court decision that overturned the abortion rights in this year, July, for like 4 months ago. Yes, because I put too many letters, small letters in the last slides, I just wanted to show some photos of some demonstrations of Korean women and civil society organizations in the recent couple of years. You see in the left side, this is the like candlelight revolution movement, and these 3 pictures are actually women's demonstrations for like decriminalizing abortion and in celebration of March 8 event and Me Too movement. And you see, I put also this capture image here in the right side, just to show that so many international medias also paid a lot of attention to the current South Korean president's anti-feminist strategies during the election campaign. And next slide, I just want to try to link the domestic and East Asian and transnational movements. First, I want to say how the Korea is nowadays viewed internationally. From the outsider's view, Korea is considered as like economically developed countries in Asia and famous for the K-pop culture. And actually, I think Korea is also not often mentioned when we talk about Asia, like Asian trends, but when it is mentioned often in diplomatic relationship, it is mostly in relation to North Korea, like North Korean threats, North Korean nuclear missiles, something like that. And from the insider's view, like from my view, like there is a long way to go in terms of women's rights. For example, Korea ranks 99 out of 156 countries in the Global Gender Gap Index. And the percentage of women politicians in the National Assembly now is just 20%. And we have the highest gender wage gap among the OECD countries, which is about 32%. However, we have a very strong feminist activism historically, and feminist movement actually have led to all the progress of women's rights policy and law framework and up until now. And now we are talking about the East Asian region. We have to think of some points. For example, I can say East Asia itself is very, very diverse area. When you think about the countries that belong to this region, like China, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia, and 2 Koreas, North and South Koreas, we can say that these countries are very different from each other when it comes to political and social and economic situations and characteristics. However, I think this diversity can be the power also for the East Asian feminist solidarity, because this diversity actually shows that women's rights issue is not the agenda which is just attached to the particular political and social economic system, but rather we need to have collective efforts to achieve it in every country. So when you say, for example, in Korea, we have a lot of diverse the social movement, and some people say that okay, the labor issue is the first agenda, it should be prioritized, and after that we achieve the labor equality, and then women's rights can be automatically achieved, something like that. But we have to say that women's rights agenda is itself is the goal, and we need to have additional collective efforts to achieve it in every country. And among these efforts, I think we can find a lot of commonalities in East Asian region also, such as low birth rate, aging society, patriarchal ideology, and economic growth, and also young feminist movements, and so on. And one additional point I want to add is that in many cases, Asian countries are like categorized as the countries that have the similar characteristics. Of course, there are a lot of similarities and sameness. However, in some issues, some East Asian countries' positions are somewhat different from other parts of Asia. For example, climate justice, like land grabbing and neoliberalism issues, labor exploitation, and marriage migration, and so on. So therefore, when you're collaborating with other activists in various countries, I think we always keep in mind that our feminist solidarity can be started based on our own critical perceptions of the countries that I belong to. Yes, and the last slide. I just wanted to list up some important experiences of the East Asian and Asian feminist transnational movements, just for your information, like East Asian feminist solidarity to bring military comfort to women issues to the global table, and it contributed a lot to the development of global norm on sexual violence in the military conflict from 1990s to 2000s. And also, we are doing a lot of efforts to continue to build the solidarity among the East Asian feminist activism. We had a big forum on the review of the BPA, Beijing Platform for Action implementation for the Beijing plus 25 in 2019. And we also had a lot of collaborations going on in terms of analyzing the impacts on South Asian women of the emerging digitalization and also climate justice and so on. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation, and I'm really looking forward to other presentations of the panelists and also the Q&A session and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was full of good information. I want to ask a really quick, short follow-up question before we move to the next speaker. And the follow-up is, you said that the words you would use to describe the situation in South Korea now were crisis and backlash. To what extent would you say that the backlash is generated by factors coming from within South Korea, or to what extent is the backlash caused by the larger sort of international climate of, you know, rising authoritarianism and rising, well, kind of a hard masculinity that's behind a lot of the authoritarian movement and so on. Is this backlash completely domestically generated, or would you say that there is some infection coming from abroad?
I can say that nowadays the backlashes in Korea that we are facing is in larger part, of course, is from the domestic change of the political environment. We had a presidential election, and then the new president from the very conservative party took office, and right after this presidential election, we see a lot of regressive trends actually happen in terms of women's rights movement. But I have to say that also these authoritarian trends and democracy crises in the Asian countries, and also for example, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on abortion right is also interlinked in the political environment, in domestic change of the political environment. So I think these backlashes and crises in terms of women's rights in Korea are very much interlinked with these East Asian, and also the international trends of regressive trends.
We'll have more questions. I hope you can stay with us just a little longer. So our second speaker is Kavita Ramdas, a globally recognized advocate for gender equality and justice. I first met Kavita when I was at the Ford Foundation, and at that time she was director of the foundation's office in New Delhi. She had already been CEO of the Global Fund for Women, which really impressed me. She went on to become a senior advisor on global strategy at Ford, and then to lead the Open Society Foundation's Women's Rights Program. And during her time at Open Society, the foundation made its largest ever investment in gender justice with a $100 million commitment to the Generation Equality Forum last year in 2021. She's currently providing consulting and guidance on initiatives to defend democracy and protect human rights in the US and around the world. Kavita.
Salam, namaste, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and with many friends and allies. I'm really grateful to our colleague in Korea who just spoke so eloquently. One of the joys that I have had in these past 3 years during my time at the Open Society Foundations was getting to know the remarkable leadership of women's organizations in Korea, including care unions and unions of care workers inside Korea. And I think for those of you who would want to have a slightly better understanding of the ways in which the challenges that were just described are playing out, you need not look much further than taking a look at some of the K-dramas on your Netflix screens, in which such strong, articulate female characters have been brought to life by strong, articulate female writers. And yet what you see is them encountering a world in which patriarchy is all too dominant, much too overwhelming, and a reality in the way that was just described. 2.5 years ago, or even maybe just a year and a half ago, I gave an interview to a Korean newspaper about why feminism was a bad word and why young men considered feminism to be a negative experience, and what did that actually mean, and why was that the case? So I'm really happy to have had this wonderful speaker precede me. I thought what I would say a little bit, Catherine mentioned that she and I met in the context of my work at the Ford Foundation in New Delhi. I think what I'd like to speak to in the time allocated, and Catherine, please let me know when I'm on running out, is to talk a little bit more broadly about the context that, and Catherine just asked, to what extent is the challenge that is being experienced in the Korean context related to challenges that we see in other places. My colleague Lopa is at UN Women, and I'm currently part of a team trying to conduct an independent review of the UN's own ability to deliver as a system on issues of gender equality, justice, and fairness. Again, things that have long been accepted as global goods, much as democracy was accepted as a global good for a certain period of time, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War and the retrenchment of formal colonialism across the globe. I would like to suggest that the way in which we think about women's rights today cannot actually be understood except in a fundamentally intersectional analysis. That word was given to us by feminists across the global South. It was codified into a legal a framework and understanding by a remarkable Black woman professor here at Columbia, Kimberly Crenshaw. But the fundamentals of it are to resist the temptation to either stratify challenges of lack of equality and lack of voice into a sort of a system of a hierarchy of oppressions, as it were, and rather to suggest, in fact, that we cannot understand one set of diminished voice, diminished power, diminished agency without understanding multiple forms of that same diminished voice, power, and agency. And that in particular, the struggle for women's liberation and the liberation of gender non-conforming, gender expansive people has been a big piece of that, because it fundamentally threatens to blow up the norms on which most of our societies across the globe have been based. If you go on my Twitter feed, you'll see that I have a pinned tweet, which I actually put up there right during these a few weeks ago, we had the UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly meetings. I was in a meeting with 3 very senior people, all of whom had run for Secretary General, for the position of Secretary General in the last election before Secretary General Guterres actually was chosen as the new UN Secretary General. You might remember that there was a very significant push for why there had not been, up till this point in the 75 years of the UN's history, a woman as head of the United Nations. And there was an attempt to make this process more visible so that we at least knew who was running for the process. And there were some highly qualified women candidates who were in the running, who were not ultimately chosen. At this meeting that I was at, one of these people actually said the following words, and I will not attribute them, but I will say them to you because I am deeply concerned that, in fact, what we are facing is a disconnect between our understandings of lots of words that people throw around as though we all share a similar understanding of what those words are. The statement that was made by a gentleman who had been in the running for this position was the following. Well, we deeply believe in gender equality, but we don't want anything to have to do with this feminism. Because this feminism is the kind of belief system that gives rise to the following quote. This is actually a quote that has been attributed to Gloria Steinem, rightly or wrongly. You may have seen it on pins and on posters. It was something that we certainly, those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s, remember from that time. And it says, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. And the gentleman went on to say, this is exactly what we have to worry about, because we do not want women to do to us. And then he stopped. And then he stopped. And he didn't finish that sentence. What is the meaning of that saying? A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. And why was it an important saying? It's an important saying because for most of history that we know of, in recent past for sure, women were actually considered the possessions, the actual physical property of men. And everybody who's sitting in the so-called developed West can act as though that's just completely foreign to them, except it was true in every part of the world, including the so-called developed West. And until very recently in the so-called developed West, you could not have a checking account or a savings account in your own name. You couldn't get the right to vote in the United States until 2021. Alice Paul, who was a suffragette fighting for the right, was taken off to a mental asylum where thankfully a psychiatrist with some concern and consideration said, courage in women is often mistaken for mental illness. So the framing of this to say that a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle is to establish independent bodily integrity, and is to say that we are people independent of being somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's, we do not need a male guardian to make our existence valid. Hence the comments about family law and why it is so disturbing to have a situation in which, after all of this long period of fights for our rights, after all of the long period of actually having challenged patriarchy, you have a senior member of the UN who has been in these positions and ran for Secretary General saying, yes, we deeply believe in gender equality, but we cannot have this feminism business. And what was more disturbing was it was not challenged in a room full of equally well-established, well-articulated, and highly powerful women with the ability to have actually challenged that statement. I set that story as a framework because I think it is very easy for us to be lulled into a sense that we are at a moment where this global givenness of gender equality, of democracy, of all these good things that we say that we are for peace and security, and it can evaporate like this. It can evaporate just the way Putin, after all of our discussions about nuclear weapons, can say, hey, I still have them, and you know what? If I need to use them, I will. It isn't any different from that. And it is a lot more fragile because we only won those rights in the relative length of term under a very, very short period of time. So this sense of that, we've achieved, we've arrived. When I was amongst those 30,000 women at Beijing, with that incredible sense that the Chinese even said it rained that whole time because we upset the yin-yang balance. That upsetting of the balance is what we are talking about right now. And that upsetting of the balance has now come to a place, particularly, I think, as a result of young people's having taken it to yet another level with questioning binaries as the way in which to define the world per se. Why do I find that helpful, so helpful? The transgressive nature of young people's movements around non-binary expressions of gender identity, because it challenges us on a whole set of things that patriarchy has put in place based on binaries. So patriarchy's own sense of being under severe threat has been particularly acutely affected by movements like LGBTQ and non-binary activism, precisely because the second you stop saying this is a man and this is a woman, then what gives that man all that power and authority and whatever, and says that, well, we were actually secondary, we were, whether it's the Bible that says we were made out of the rib, or whether it's Manusmriti in Hindu traditions, or whether it's, whatever other version of this cultural norm that is defined, with a whole generation saying, why is a man considered a man? Under what conditions? What does it mean? Because you're born with these sexual organs, why does that define who you are? Patriarchy is at the very root of most of the institutions that we have in our world today. It starts with the family, hence descriptions about what education is like. And I believe my colleague Rangita correctly pointed out that education per se is not a liberatory force. Education can be used as a way to prescribe a certain kind of a mentality. And we're watching it in my country, in India today, as a fascist Hindu majoritarian government is essentially pushing forward a particular vision of what does it mean to be Indian, which essentially means not just to be Hindu, but to be Hindu in a very profoundly patriarchal way. And these models of patriarchal structures of hierarchy, of obedience, of levels of discipline and control are then translated into all the other institutions that we're familiar with, in schools, in workplaces, in the UN, in big corporations, in academics, and in academia. You have the exact same models that are actually based on patriarchal models being replicated. And then the kindness has been, okay, women fought. Power, by the way, is never given. I don't use that word empowerment anymore. Nobody gives power. We have always had to take power and we have had to fight for it. And nobody, the colonial masters did not say to India one morning, oh, I'm so sorry, 250 years and all that looting later, we are so sorry. Why don't you have your independence? And neither did that happen for Black people's liberation in this country. Neither did it happen for women's liberation and our ability to be able to even have the right to vote. But at this moment, it is under threat in a particular way. Climate change has challenged nation states, and nation states are patriarchal. So the pandemic challenged the notion of the nation state as an appropriate entity for which to actually respond to today's crises. And young people are pointing that out to us in ways that have been increasingly hard to ignore, whether inside the halls of the UN or outside schools. And I don't think it is surprising that we are seeing this backlash, whether it is Putin or Erdogan or Modi or Trump or, and it is not that women are all universally on some, wonderful, agreed upon challenge to that dynamic, because we are also part of the patriarchy. Fanon famously said about colonized people that it is the internalization of oppression that makes it possible for colonizers to continue to colonize us. And most of us who have grown up in patriarchal cultures, women particularly, have been basically given this role. You are the vessels of culture. You shall continue this wonderful tradition of telling your sons, darlings, you don't need to do anything, and telling your daughters, clean up, wash up, make things, do the things that have to be done, serve your sons, serve your husbands, serve your brothers. So I think we should be prepared for this backlash. I think we should have seen it coming. I think movements like Me Too and movements like the Black Lives Matter movements and movements around gender justice and gender equality and gender expression, it isn't an accident that these are happening in states that are becoming increasingly authoritarian. It isn't an accident that Hungary throws the Open Society Foundations out, even as it refuses to accept that there could be any gay people in its country. It isn't an accident that they use the term gender ideology. The term gender has become suspect. Why somebody can run for the presidency of South Korea and win on an anti-feminist platform is because gender itself has become a code word for a very, actually they are right. The thing about this that I think is funny is that for many of us who are feminists, we have been going on touting this thing saying that, gender equality and gender equity, it's a win-win. The world will be so much better off. It's just, we will all do better. And we have been preaching this to patriarchal leadership. And then we're surprised that they don't buy it. Why are we surprised? Of course they don't buy it because it isn't true. It isn't true that when Black people and women and young people have voice and power and agency, that your life will be the same. It isn't true when the wife at home says, honey, you pick up your own socks, thanks. That life is the same. It isn't the same. It isn't going to be that comfortable. It isn't going to be that easy. And it's going to be very, different than the life you had before. So yes, we can say feminists across the world will be in a better position, but patriarchy is going to lose power. Let's just be clear about it. This right now is a serious power struggle. We are in a struggle for the future of this planet. And patriarchy likes extraction. It's worked on it all along. Read the Bible. It says, thou shalt have dominion over the earth and its creatures. Dominion and husbandry is the basis of which power over women and gender non-conforming people is established. And so I would just simply end by saying that while this seems like it's at a very theoretical level, what you are seeing in terms of how this is translating into policies is a set of policies being put in place and often coming through the ballot. Don't forget that a majority of white women voted for Trump in this country, not because they were making a stupid decision, by the way. If you have to choose between the power you have as a woman and the power you have as a white person in this country today, being white definitely gives you more power than being a woman. 100 times more power. So what would you choose? you're going to choose like having white power because this guy is saying to you, I'm going to make sure that we white people are staying in power over here. So, okay, you're going to, he's going to say he can grab your pussy and you're going to be fine with it because you are basically choosing what your struggles are. So I hope that my comments can actually shed some light on the nature of what is facing us as transnational women's movements across the globe. And to say that while this is sort of depressing, the reason to be optimistic is that we have actually laid down such a significant challenge to the patriarchy at this moment of time that what we're seeing in response is actually a tribute to the strength and power of women's movements and not something that we should be feeling defeated by, but actually encouraged by. Thank you very much.
That was every bit as bracing and honest as I expected. And my quick follow-up question for you, Kavita. In this moment that you've set out for us, do you think that the transnational women's movement, as I've described it, is united or fragmented in its response to these challenges?
I think it's both. I think the incredible inequality of the power hierarchies between global north and global south, the incredible concentration of wealth in places like we've worked in philanthropies and in individuals who now have net worths worth, the entire national budgets of, not 1 or 2 countries, but 5 or 10 countries. Makes it difficult for transnational women's movements to build alliances that are truly in the spirit of sisterhood is global, which we had in the 80s. But I also think that there is something new that is happening, which is the resources that we have, particularly the internet and the ability to mobilize across boundaries, not necessarily in person. Pyro was amazing and wonderful, but young people have figured out how to do that in different ways that don't require us all to get on a plane. And that actually does give me a lot of hope. So I wouldn't say we are united, but I think we are experimenting with new ways of organizing that have the potential to actually be every bit as radical and as revolutionary. I think we have to stay alert because just as you're seeing in Iran right now, the West will always try to capitalize on an indigenous movement to challenge authoritarianism by saying, oh, it's all about the hijab. Look at these wonderful young women with their long hair and they're cutting off their long. There's this still Orientalism that affects the way the West looks at the rest of the world. But I actually do believe that what we are seeing in countries around the world is that women have been at the forefront of challenges to authoritarianism. And they refuse to be defined anymore by quote unquote women's issues. What they're demanding is a seat at the table to speak on all issues, because those are the issues that matter to more than half of the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Yiping Tsai, who is a member of the Executive Committee of Dawn, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. The Dawn is a network of feminist scholars, researchers, and activists from the Economic South who are working for economic and gender justice and sustainable and democratic development. Ms. Tsai has been active in women's movements in China and regionally in Asia and globally. She was a researcher at the Women's Studies Institute in China, and early in her career was a journalist with the China Women's News. If I'm not mistaken, Yiping, one of your first assignments was covering the 1995 Women's Conference in Beijing. Exactly, yes. Many of us remember that event viscerally, and the rain. Her areas of interest include women's human rights, gender and media, international development cooperation with a focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and body and sexuality. She's working on a PhD now at University of California, Irvine in the Global Studies Department. So, Yiping.
And also for all the wonderful presentations this morning. I think it's very inspiring. So I was assigned to talk about, first give some words to describe what the status now in terms of women's rights. I would describe the current moment for women's rights in China as a juxtaposition of challenging and hopeful. I say that I think it echoes what I've discussed this morning about pessimistic and optimistic. Why challenging? China has faced many challenges, as you know, globally in other part of the world to achieve gender equality and women's rights. First, as a professor said in this morning, a global gender gap report that published by the World Economic Forum was ranked 106 out of the 153 countries that were surveyed. There's also considerable, actually, the steady drop since 2008, when China was ranked 57 at that time. Due to the poor performance in women's political participation and newborn sex ratio imbalance. I always, also very critical and suspicious about what indicators being applied for those surveys, but I think in general give a good picture of where your country is situated in the global scale. So women's labor force participation rate, there's something Chinese government and always been proud of, is relatively higher than the world average. The women count for 37.2% of all employees in urban work units. However, there has been a considerable decrease in the last 2 decades. I think this is also the women's formal economic participation or labor participation also going down. And let alone, the occupational compositions of women and men are differed considerably. In the area of social security, the proportion of women who receive the minimum subsistence allowance was lower than that of men in both urban and rural settings, with rural women as the lowest. That's all the figures are from the National Bureau of Statistics. It's the government official figures, which I believe is not exaggerates, this gender disparity and gender gap. Of course, the proportion of women in leadership at all levels are still very low, with only 1 woman was on the political bureau as the highest leadership. The body, the governing body in China. And women, according to the Times Youth Survey, shows that women are still men and the housework, bearing the housework, and they spend on unpaid work. It's about twice of that men. But this is considered better than Korea and Japan. So the gender-based violence remained one of the most imperative women's human rights issue that was drawn to grave concern of feminist activists and the general public because of the horrendous given thanks for the the new media and social media. So those horrendous cases of domestic violence, sexual harassment, trafficking of women, femicide exposed by the media or social media from time to time often stirred the public outcry on the deteriorating situation of women in bodily security and autonomy. But last but not least, about this challenging is researchers also point out that women's rights and gender equality advocacy has faced a dual challenge from both authoritarian state censorship and the neoliberalism marketization. This manifests in the stigmatization of feminist activism as anti-government action manipulated by the Western hostile forces and the state crackdown on the feminist NGOs and Me Too movement in China. And also this lead to the shrinking space for the social mobilization on the one hand. On the other, the rising problematic narrative of entrepreneurship or entrepreneur opportunities that the proposed gender equality can be achieved by assumptions and investing sexual capital in the marriage market. So these two strands of anti-feminism can also be observed in the current global gender politics across the globe. I think this is not only the exception to China. But why I'm still hopeful? After I've said everything about the challenge, what are the signs of hope for me being hopeful and still optimistic? One, I think it's about the legitimacy. So the women's rights and gender issues is gained the legitimacy, at least in paper. Not only domestically, but also globally, as was a previous speaker has mentioned. It's also institutionalized through domestic and international legislations, policy frameworks, and mechanisms such as national constitutions, the set of the legal framework, the CEDAW, and affirmed by the numerous negotiated documents like SDGs. It is so strong as to be overtuned and overthrown entirely. But it can be distorted and can be narrated and by the oppositions and by anti-women's rights forces. For example, from the women's bodily integrity and sexual reproductive health and rights, it can be refocused on the family and focus on women's versus women's individual rights, and also can focus on duties rather than the rights. So this kind of distortions and confusions, of course, and the attempt to kind of cooptation. So all these things is happen at the same time. But I think, as previous speaker have said, it's not something we should feel depressed. I think this is another example that's how we have made progress that make those people are actually trembling. And what they can do is really trying to secure their authority or their privilege, this patriarchal system, by all means, by attacking, by re-narrating. So this is what I see. There's still hope. But secondly, I think about the women's rights and civil societies has gained more experience than before. And the strategies they have applied is also become more diversified than before. For example, the NGO, the notion of NGO was introduced into China through the Women's Conference. It's not long time ago, actually. But I would say women's rights advocacy has not begun, from the 1995. The Chinese women has been for a long time, fight for the rights to vote, education, and I will mention it later on. But I just want to mention that actually there is more experience, and there was the new strategies has been, trying the feminists and other social movement has re-strategized based on this changing, ever-changing, the scenario globally and domestically. For example, I will mention like the UN and the international mechanism has become more useful and more approachable for Chinese NGOs that have been using CEDAW. For example, the first few reviews of CEDAW, there was no Chinese NGO or civil society participation at all. But I personally have attended since 2006 and 2014. I'm hoping to observe another one in next year. So this is gave a new space for the advocacy and rights advocacy. And lastly, I also think the China's role that is playing and this influence on the global stage has opened a new kind of door for the movement, for mobilization, not only for China, but it's also opened the opportunity for the construction of this, solidarity across the global South. So I see it also as the opportunity. So eventually the women's, I just gave you our anecdotal that we had a discussion 5 years ago when we discussed about, after this feminist 5 and after this imposition of the the implementation of the new law that's cutting the fund from access to the foreign fundings for Chinese civil societies. So we get together, young and old generations, and talk about, so what we're gonna do? There's no hope, what we can, maintain this movement, and what's the future of the movement, how to move forward. But the first question we discussed actually is, where is the forward? There's no forward. I think we're asking ourselves, and we come up this, conclusion that the forward is a direction where we want to go. It's not like something someone has pointed for us and oriented us. It's where we want to go. Of course, there's no shortcut. Basically, there is no existing road at all. So we have to have this belief that we will get there because we have our vision. I think that is a kind of guide us towards where it is forward and how we can. Maybe we're not go through the same road. Maybe we have to continue to change. If this is testing the water, so that when there's not possible, we should try something else. But anyway, that is so out of that conversation, people are not that depressed. At least the kind of self-care, the healing sessions. But I would also like to respond some other questions, if I may. I think I have 3 minutes. I just want to say, like, actually, if you're looking at the other questions that you have asked about women's movement historically were part of larger domestic social movement for independence, the anti-colonialism, national development. So how this legacy continue to affect the women's and methods. I think this is really a very big question that can only be addressed from the multiple dimensions: history, present, and the future, and both from local and global perspective. But I want to emphasize here is that many existing literature on women's history, on Chinese history, on Chinese women's movement has reviewed that for Chinese thinkers and political leaders, women's liberation has always been an integral part of the political agenda to pursue the national sovereignty, economic development, and the modernization. So I think for Chinese leadership, this nation building and the world making process cannot be separate from, the gender and women's rights agenda. So this is a very interesting, history and maybe, the legacy that we can better, take advantage of. I think there was this research this morning talking about, there's how, the husband has been using this legal system or civil case to proclaim their rights or entitlement and, limiting women's sexual and reproductive health and the body integrity. I was surprised when they mentioned about this case and about the very few women actually was claiming, their rights and defend their rights. There was a book published in 2016 by Professor Cong Xiaoping. The book is titled Marriage, Law, and Gender in Revolutionary China, 1940s to 60s. Shows that Chinese Revolution and its legal practices produced new discourses and cultural symbols at the time that contained China's experience in the 20th century social movement, and how revolutionary practice was part of this, was contribute to this, formation of the concept of self-determination. This idea that bridged local experience with the tendency of 20th century world, that's the revolutionary legacy for China today. So I was surprised why there's no women what's claimed for their self-determination. As in the more than half century ago, because this book is also research on the legal cases from 1940 to 60s, of course, under the regime of the CCP at the time, and actually the judges, the CCP support women's claim on self-determination on the ground, under the ground, and to kind of challenging this arranged marriage. So they recognize, Liu Qiao'er or others, they have their rights on the, the concept of self-determination. Of course, self-determination was not only, related to China or the national, but it's also international. But where it is now, after the NAM or this, if you look at the history of the, the South, countries, has been, the struggle to anti-colonialism. So the self-determination is a very crucial concept there. And lastly, I want to call, maybe there's a time, my topic is focusing on China, but I want to propose, this to reframe those issues around China and Chinese women's movement and Chinese women's rights in this new perspective of global China. Why I'm saying that? Not because I'm now from the global studies department, so I put everything, global in front of everything. But I think it's very important. This analytical framework will ask question about who, why, and so what among the multiple actors. Not only look at the state actor, but also look at the enterprise, the business sector, as well as the social movement, the civil sectors. So, and also include not only, the oppression, genus kind of regime, but also looking at resistance, the bargaining, accommodating, appropriating, and adapting. So this research, I think this perspective will offer some alternatives to understand China, especially I think the current China's as this expand this economic, political, and other influence globally, especially and also help us to think about China and global South relations. So this global China as a method will require us to look in China beyond the territorial boundaries and analyze the various actors involving in the process. So this is very exciting for me. And this leads to my last point, which how the civil society organizations, especially women's movement, could collaborate and in current challenging context to advance the human rights, social, and ecological justice agenda. Can we develop a new strategy and identify the advocacy space to challenge and contest the current, the dominating narratives and practice in development, in human rights, in many of these multiple spaces, including in UN, multilateral and bilateral platforms, and how we build this solidarity. I remember, just give example, I was in the Rio +20 conference. And Dawn has brought a group of activists from the Global South. So one of the colleagues from Cambodia, we went together to this events organized by Chinese government. We have Chinese ministers talking about, how wonderful China has been doing to protect the environment. So after that, my colleague from Cambodia asked me, Yiping, can you please translate? I need to talk to your minister. I said, what? Why you need to talk to her? That China has developed this, there was a development project in capital city of Cambodia, and they would actually has driven the local community out of that, the areas where they want to build fancy new residence houses. And women is at the forefront of that struggle. And I think 5 of them were arrested. So they have launching this campaign, released Feminist 5, another Feminist 5. That was in 2012. So she wanted, I was not prepared, to confront my minister at that, space. But I think that is just a reminder of, how important we need to think about into the future, the South-South solidarity. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you. Looking forward to discussion with you.
Your last point is tees up something maybe we can get into a bit in the discussion, this question of how China's rising wealth and power doesn't just change how China behaves as a nation state on the world stage, but to some extent it changes how you as Chinese citizens interact on the world stage and how Chinese organizations and NGOs interact on the world stage. And so the presumption of South-South solidarity may be disrupted by the reality of imbalanced power relationships within the so-called global South. So this is obviously an incredibly complex question, but maybe we'll have time to get into that. I just wanted to briefly ask you one follow-up, picking up, you mentioned the 2017 law that cut off a great deal of foreign or international funding for civil society groups in China. And this did severely impact quite a few civil society organizations that had been heavily reliant on international and foreign funding, including many women's groups, also LGBT groups, for example, because they really don't have a lot of other sources of funding. And now in the present, we've been seeing quite a few stories about Me Too challenges, the violence in the Tangshan, so-called Tangshan barbecue restaurant attack, where a group of men just with impunity beat up a group of women at a restaurant, and this kind of thing. And the appeal is sort of made to the world community to intervene, to sustain and support the beleaguered women's movement in China. In other words, at least this is how I often read things, that the world should support, and therefore the transnational women's movement should come to the support of the beleaguered women's movement in China. But as we've just said, there is a limit to how they can support because of the funding cutoff. And I'm also wondering, is there a need? Do Chinese women want transnational support, or what form of support would you want? You know, is it helpful if you are aligned with foreign forces? Is it helpful if you are receiving even rhetorical support from foreign sources, or is that harmful?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think we have discussed a lot among our colleagues about what kind of support actually we needed from the international community. Definitely, I think the feminist movement has always been international and transnational. Chinese women's rights advocates had been benefiting from this since the very beginning. In terms of the agenda setting, for example, the anti-domestic violence or the women's human rights, all this concept actually was introduced because of this transnational activism. So definitely, I think that's the support. There are many different kind of support that needed. I think one is the agenda and analysis. And second, I think it is a mechanism that already, I would see this mechanism as the result of the collective advocacy in multiple level, from local to the global. So that's also helpful. I think in the past, maybe we over-rely on the financial support, but now we see maybe less importance for the financial support. I was surprised actually in China, there's also a merging philanthropic kind of, in the trends that encouraged by the government, but also there was also awareness on the needs for the philanthropic kind of work for Chinese society. Some of this women's group or the LGBT group was very innovative, given also the internet and this online mobilization. They were able to mobilize resources beyond what they have imagined. They were very surprised, actually, like how they were able to mobilize that resources. And I think some social groups also think about set up their own funds, so that I think they're looking into the resource mobilization within the country. So I think this is when you're in the crisis, you become more innovative, the creative, and now I think rather than the financial resources, and we're looking more the support from the other aspects from the international communities.
So our next speaker is Lopa Banerjee, who is the executive coordinator of the Generation Equality Forum and also director of the Civil Society Division at UN Women. The Generation Equality Forum is a global multi-stakeholder partnership launched to accelerate the achievement of gender equality commitments by states. And Ms. Banerjee also leads UN Women's strategic engagement and partnership initiatives with women's and human rights groups, other civil society networks, youth groups, social justice actors in order to promote gender equality. She's had a long career in international development, focusing on advocacy and partnership building in support of gender equality. And all of this, of course, goes straight to the heart of our theme. And I hope you will tell us from the transnational side and from the international side how you view everything that we have just been talking about.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I want to start by thanking you very much for inviting UN Women to this dialogue. And I am, of course, very honored to be in the company of friends, sojourners, and fellow activists and advocates. That said, I am a bit of an outlier on this panel. I'm not here as a member of the women's movement. I am rather here as a public official, an international civil servant, a representative of UN Women, which is part of the UN ecosystem of organizations. And allow me to explain a little bit the context from which I'm speaking. UN Women is the United Nations entity that is dedicated to work on gender equality. And it was established 11 years ago through the bold, fearless, 10-year-long activism of the women's movement and civil society, working together with the governments that are members of the United Nations to set up UN Women. We call these governments that are members of the United Nations, these countries that are members of the United Nations, we call them member states. And so because UN Women was born of this massive 10-year-long relentless campaign by the women's movement and civil society to set it up, our relationship, meaning UN Women's relationship with civil society, is existential. And UN Women is an intergovernmental organization. And that means that our governance system is that of governments. Member states govern our executive board. And the United Nations is composed of 193 member states. That, of course, is a very wide-ranging group of states. UN Women's role, and the reason it was set up as this dedicated entity to work on gender equality, UN Women's role is to support these member states of the United Nations to set standards for gender equality and women's rights globally, to implement those standards, and then to be held accountable for the implementation of those standards. And UN Women does this with the core and central participation of civil society and the women's movements. And this is why the work of the women's movement and civil society is so central to the work of UN Women, because the fight for gender equality, the movement for gender equality, has been led by the women's movement. Everything that we have achieved for gender equality, the impetus of it has come from the women's movement. And then states have enshrined this within legal frameworks. And then there are, other groupings that take that forward. But the impetus comes from the women's movement. And so UN Women has offices in over 60 countries in the world. And we partner with civil society and women's rights organizations and the members of the women's movement across diverse sectors in these different parts of the world. And we do so because the feminist movement, advocacy, and activism are so central to advancing any standards for gender equality in the world, whether these are existing standards or whether these are new standards that need to be developed as we look at the world and the manner in which it evolves. And so the need to have a robust feminist movement, a robust transnational movement for gender equality and women's rights across the world is absolutely central to achieving this kind of multilateral mandate of the United Nations and of UN Women. And Kavita, or rather Catherine, you spoke about Kavita's role at the Open Society Foundation around generation equality. Generation equality, which I lead, was set up in the 25th anniversary, as part of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Why was it set up? Because the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was adopted by all of the member states of the United Nations at the time in 1995, and then subsequently the additional states that came on adopted it. But in the review that we did in leading up to the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, it was in 2020, it was clear that in these intervening 25 years, the investment in gender equality, the implementation of commitments that governments had made, commitments that they had agreed and made, the investment in gender equality, the implementation of those commitments, and the political will for progress was woefully inadequate. And the intergovernmental framework, meaning the United Nations framework of governments that upholds these norms and standards that governments come together to set up, that intergovernmental framework was not delivering. What was being delivered in the world was the women's movement, the people's movements at that point in time, citizens' movements across the world, whether it was Me Too, whether it was Ni Una Menos, the citizen democracy movements in different parts of the world, all led by young people and women and in the forefront. They were delivering change on the ground, but not this intergovernmental framework. And so the formation of generation equality was to bring together, centralize this women's movement together with governments, together with philanthropy, together with other stakeholders in this multi-stakeholder modality of co-creation and co-leadership, recognizing what would be the critical priorities that needed to be funded, resourced, and that needed a time-bound, accountable implementation plan. So generation equality is for 5 years. and it completes its 5-year term in 2025. And so the idea, and it looks at 6 critical areas of achievement, which are, and all of the stakeholders that are part of it, the government, civil society, philanthropy, private sector, UN, all of them are held together, hold each other collectively accountable. They monitor this as it goes along, and they are looking at resourcing it. Now, all of this said, the reason for the establishment of generation equality points actually to the state of the movement. So to your question in terms of, what is the state of the movement and how do we describe this moment in time? The reason why generation equality exists actually pertains to this, because the state of the movement in Asia is exactly the state of the movement elsewhere in the world. And that is that this is a global moment of incredible pressure on democratic institutions. And the United Nations as a democratic institution, the United Nations is called a parliament of nations. And it's very democratic nature that holds it hostage. And so this pressure on democratic institutions, the rise of anti-rights movements all over, and an erosion of civic space across different contexts, this is what holds the United Nations hostage. It's what holds the women's movement hostage everywhere in the world. And so how do we see this playing out in the women's movement today? During the last decade, we have seen a visible and a growing drive against gender equality across the globe. So in fact, I am going to posit something a little different from what Kavita laid out when she talked about the fact that we are talking about gender equality, we have achieved gender equality, or we are at a positive moment for gender equality. It is the achievements of gender equality that we have been fragile, not sustainable, not resourced, and not enduring. And therefore, we are in a moment where gains that the women's movement and the gender equality movement, hard-fought gains that have been made over the last 25 years or more, actually starting from CEDAW back in the 1940s, from that time and more, are being rolled back, have been rolled back, and are at risk of being rolled back further. This includes a slew of things, from fundamental rights, bodily autonomy, economic rights, violence against women, political rights, everything. I mean, it's a slew of rights. And the danger is that this rollback is not a fragile rollback, because the rollback is entrenching itself in legal frameworks. And so the backlash that we see today in the world is a coming together. It's a coming together of transnational networks of conservative, religious, and right-wing actors, political parties, churches, non-governmental organizations, and governments. And what we are seeing now is that increasingly hostile governments, governments hostile to women's rights and gender equality, are discrediting gender equality objectives themselves. And so there is a polarization that is being created. So, within governments, within the United Nations, within these multilateral, global, regional, national policy-making spaces, legal frameworks are being rolled back, and defenders of these rights are not only discredited, they are being criminalized with criminal prosecution of their work and of their organizations. So it is an organized decimation of protest movements, of women's movements, institutionally and also non-organically, so to speak. And we see these attacks on gender equality rights and attacks on women's rights groups as also a part of a change in state political will to consult with women's rights groups, civil society, and so on. And this alters the relationship between the women's movement organizations and the states, and leads to an overall backsliding of gender equality in the long run. And of course, as I was saying, because the United Nations is formed of member states, this echoes in the halls of the United Nations all the time. Women's rights and gender equality in the United Nations has become caught in the crossfire between opposing groups of states. So it's not that this is consistent across all the member states of the United Nations. There are member states of the United Nations that are champions and allies of women's movements, of civil society. Not consistently, but significantly enough. But so there are these groupings that have emerged. So there are those states that are allies of gender equality, and there are states that are hostile to gender equality. And because the United Nations is a democratic institution and it governs through democratic processes, it has become moribund and caught in this logjam with the inability to move the agenda forward because it is caught in this democratic impasse. And that is reflective of the reality of the world as well. So there are the women's movement is also is diverse, and there are a multiplicity of issues on which members of the women's movement disagree. But what have been philosophical debates so far in the women's movement have now become fissures that are dividing the movement. And what has ended up happening is that these actors, the hostile actors, the member states and others, and because it's a grouping that has come together, governments, political parties, religious groups, conservative civil society, all of them have come together, well-funded, extremely strategic, with the clear objective of undermining legal frameworks so that the legal basis of women's movements to hold their governments to account, the legal basis on the strength of which women's movements have advanced the struggle so far, that itself is undermined. That legal basis is undermined. And so what this is doing is that the gender equality agenda has been co-opted. And these actors are using the voices of these various actors, including civil society, to redefine the gender equality agenda. Redefine it from the perspective of family, redefine it from the perspective of national sovereignty, redefine it from the perspective of cultural sovereignty, cultural rights, and therefore, even when the UN is discussing or working on norm setting to address, for example, coming out of COVID, the enormous acceleration of unpaid care work and looking at the care economy and how that was affected by COVID. So when there is a policy discussion on looking at new policy prescriptions to address that, the concept of care work is contested because it involves looking at redistribution of labor within the family and, of course, within society and the roles of states to do so. So the conversation that is really important to have right now is, what are the strategies that we need to address this? What are the strategies of solidarity that we need to address this? What is a common agenda setting modality? And how do we create political engagement strategies that have the strength to, and that are strategic, that address, recognize what is happening in terms of the movement and its delegitimization legally, because that is a very dangerous process. Building institutions is a very long process. Building legal frameworks is a very long process. Destroying them is done in a heartbeat. And so the importance of looking at collaboration and solidarity building across is crucial. Now, I know that this dialogue, the Gelatt dialogues, looks at different thematic topics every year. But whether or not progress towards gender equality is central or peripheral to your individual scholarship goals, what I would like to conclude by saying is that this polarization and backlash is not limited to women's rights. This is actually an issue of illiberalism and co-option of democratic processes to promote non-democratic behavior, institutions, policies, law, non-democratic law. And it spans a range of issues, from indigenous rights to disability rights, same-sex relations. Fundamental human rights frameworks are affected by this. And so it is imperative that we are aware of these interconnections. And it is imperative that we collaborate in every manner possible, strategic and political, to preserve established global norms and legislative frameworks that serve all the peoples of the world equally and are also agile and responsive to recognizing where the gaps lie and what strategies are required to address those gaps. Let me leave it there.
Organized decimation of the women's movement. Pretty stunning language. I just want to briefly ask you before I throw it open to questions from the floor and also from people on Zoom, whether these kind of direct and honest conversations or discussions are being held. You spoke of this echoing in the halls of the UN, but I figuratively or literally, are you having these kinds of very direct and honest discussions in the halls of the UN in these terms?
So, as I said, indeed, I mean, for UN Women, for example, the centrality of its work with civil society and women's rights groups and ensuring that people like Yuping and Kavita are in the spaces of policymaking, raising these issues. And the fact of looking at an initiative like Generation Equality, which brings together women's movement actors together with member states to be able to raise these issues. This is happening. You know, the Secretary General has a whole initiative called Our Common Agenda, which talks about a new global social contract with people and citizens and civil society and young people. So yes, these conversations are happening at the United Nations, but as I have said, there is both championship and there is backlash, and so that dichotomy exists. And so while the conversations happen and conversations are frank, the ability to build the necessary political strategy to counter it is not yet strong enough.
So this is a question for this wonderful panel or any of the other panelists. It's a question to which I don't know the answer. It seems to me that in the United States, the core passion and militancy of the anti-choice movement comes from a small minority that believes that the fetus is a human being from the moment of conception. And that belief has profound implications, obviously, for both reproductive rights and for human rights generally. If the fetus is a human being from the moment of conception, there it goes. You have to think about what that means in human rights terms. Is there any country in the United States in which a powerful minority advances that view, or are we alone in that?
Did you? So I think that with the issue, let me answer it in a different way. Let me respond. I'm not answering. I'm just responding with the perspective. I think the aspects around, a woman and a family's right to choose, the idea of bodily autonomy and choice, reproductive choice, that fundamentally has been contested in different contexts, in different in different countries through different legal frameworks for a long time. And that has also been an area of deep advance by the women's movement, because many countries have introduced legislation guaranteeing a woman's right to choose. So, in response, is it a minority? Is it not? Has it been held up? Because it deals with something so fundamental, and it is such a deeply powerful personal choice. It goes back to the idea of who controls that power. And therefore, it continues to be, it has been for a very long time. It has been enshrined in international legal frameworks. The fact that a woman's right to choose is very much part of international legal frameworks, but this is always mediated by national law in different countries and contexts.
I would also like to, because this make me think about, the rights itself, the narrative of rights and how it's been kind of redefined and also be manipulated by the oppositions. Even the reproductive rights or, rights to choose and now can be reinterpreted in a different way, in a way that against the women's rights, like, and especially I think this new formulation are intended to attract the young people who are concerned about social justice, ecological justice. I think this is what I think you have mentioned about distracting power. So I think that is a part of this, global trends of the deconstructing the rights language, the rights framing, deconstructing the gender equality and delegitimizing, all this so-called progressive language. And it's very difficult because as I also experienced when I'm observing, those UN meetings, it's given, the space that given and, facilitated by the UN Women and the other institutions, those are very easy, like you distract something is very easy because sometimes when we discussed among, advocates, like why it's so difficult for us to advocating some new language, progressive language, and it's so easy for the opposition, the government, to just, diminish everything. Why their strategy is so effective, and how we learn from their effective strategies. I said, no, we cannot, because we want to construct and they want to distract. We cannot copy their strategy because we're, in a different track. But I do have a question, since this is a question bothered me for a long time, since there are so many very prestigious and legal professors here in this room. My question is about, there's so many good laws in Asia, in Eastern Asia, as we have, talk about Japan, in Korea, China, but it's poorly implemented. There's so many poor laws here in this country, was seriously implemented, very effectively implemented. So my question is how it happened, and from the legal, perspective, what's this imply? There's just something to do with this, how confident that people have, like in Asia, because I think overall this what's credibility of those laws was very questionable. So the people actually didn't really take it seriously. Even, the people who, even the law is prohibit this and that, people are still, kind of disobedient, this kind of, practice there was that prohibit the laws and the entitlement, the rule, disobedience. But here, it seems like nothing you can do but just rely on another round of, maybe progressive, administration, or change the law or revert the law again. I was listening to this radio program right after, the Supreme Court overturned. That's the clinic, the practitioners was crying, but it seems like there's nothing they can do. They just, returned the call and said, sorry, they already, scheduled like, an abortion, but said, no, we cannot do anything now. It's heartbreaking, but I just want to know why from the legal perspective. I want to be enlightened.
So I don't know if any of the Americans in the room would like to quickly address that question.
So we also ignore law, so that it's not perfect enforcement. But it is true that the more I learn about this and other issues, an increasing gap between the formal law that a government says before CEDAW it has and what actually happens on the ground is quite common throughout. Excellent divorce law in China, but how easy is it for a woman to actually get one? Excellent sex harassment law in China, but terrible on the ground. But as you indicate, when the Supreme Court eliminates the right to abortion under constitutional law, And we have a system that, because of how they did it, allocates it to the states of the US. Those states then are ready to pass every bad law you can imagine. And it becomes very hard in our system to totally ignore that, especially if there's a penalty attached. So that a doctor who does an abortion and faces possible criminal penalties is going to think very hard about that. But it is true that we have a little less of a gap. And that can be a problem when you elevate what you call democracy. And here we're talking about legislatures, all 50 of them, above all else, right? But that's, quote, the rule of law. But I can't resist, because I have never heard a UN diplomat be so candid in my life. That was bracing. I was expecting the world's most boring approach. And I guess the one thing I would ask you, when you call democracy, I tend to think of funding. Who funds you? And if, let's just name a name, Saudi Arabia, funds you or funds the Human Rights Council. Money talks at the UN. It always has. So that's part of the problem. It's not democracy in a loose sense. It's money, because a lot of these programs are voluntary funding. And so I guess my inclination, and I teach UN, so I'm supposedly a believer in the UN, but it makes me feel like there's something to be said, especially on human rights and maybe on this issue, for Biden's League of Democracies. That is another forum that is subject to democracy, but maybe with not the horrible results you're describing. Did I read you wrong?
I think that what I was saying, you see, I mean, the UN was founded on this idea that a parliament of nations with collective accountability, holding each other account for shared goals of peace and justice, will be the answer to the Second World War and its devastation, right? And so the notion of shared, just governance through democratic processes, and that's why it's a parliament of nations. That idea is at the core of the UN and its and its Charter of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it is about, I always say this, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with the words, we the peoples. It does not begin with the words, we the governments. But what has ended up happening at the UN is that it is governments and administrations that are, and because it is a democracy, I'm not arguing against democracy, but I'm saying that what is important for us, and that's why that was my question and comment in this group of the consideration of law, because again, laws reflect a society's most treasured values, and therefore, and laws change. I mean, apartheid was the law of the land at one point in time. So the legal frameworks that the UN came up with reflected its collective values of justice and peace and equality. And so even the funding system of the UN was everything, it's called, these were called assessed contributions. All of the member states of the United Nations fund a core pool. They are not, they are not able to decide you can put money here or you can put money there. It goes into a collective pool, and then the UN allocates it across different agencies. That said, different UN agencies also seek their individual funding from countries, and those fund specific programs and so on and so forth. But this is actually not related so much to funding. So to your point, I'm not going to name states. I am a UN diplomat. But so I'm not going to name states. But on norm-setting bodies, such as the Commission on the Status of Women, such as the Human Rights Council. These are norm-setting bodies. These are bodies that help states implement norms, help states monitor norms. You have norm-defying nations on those bodies as the governance of those bodies. That has nothing to do with money. That has to do with the way the UN was set up and how inappropriate it is to this time. It was set up with the notion that, governments and countries and all of this was collective. But today, where we have landed up is the same thing. It is what we see playing out in countries where, governments are destroying democratic institutions through legislation. And so that is being reflected at the UN, because basically at the UN in a global framework, you're reflecting exactly what that country is doing at its national level.
So we have unfortunately gone over time. I want to just give Frank, if you have a brief question, I'll give you a chance to air it if it's very, very brief, and then we're going to move to our closing.
Thank you. I would just like to ask Tsai Ying-ping, I wasn't clear what, I think you said that women's status in the PRC has declined. But I wasn't exactly clear, but you've nodded. So let's assume you said it has declined. I just ask you why. An easy question, I'm sure.
In 10
Easy
seconds or
question
less.
is the most difficult to answer. I think in terms of a decline, I'm using the indicators by the global gender gap indicator. So I think that's the show the decline. But why? There's so many reasons. I think one reason is that the current economic growth driven policies not really put the social justice at the forefront of the policy agenda. Then women and women's rights is a kind of affected the most, and along with other so-called socially vulnerable groups. That is the one. And the second is also to do with this lack of redistribution justice. And the third, I would say, is also to do with this undemocratic kind of, there are no democratic participation process and the mechanism, and many reasons. And I think another reason is also to do with the cultural norms and practice. For example, the one indicator is about the sum preference and the sexual ritual at birth imbalance. So that is a contribute mostly to the cultural norms, because that's what's prohibited by all the legal framework, but it persists. And I would say this the visibility of the inequality and the disparity is also to do with the awareness raising. So the people is more aware of this inequality, given the increase, the education, the opportunity that the women compared to the past. I think the younger generation is more aware of this inequality, discrimination they have suffered compared to their previous generations.
So we have to leave it there. Thank you so very much for your wonderful contributions to this discussion. Could obviously go on for another hour or so. Thank you.
So when we asked, well, who can close this session, the only name that came to mind is the one that's coming forward, Rebecca Cook. She's Professor Emeritus, but believe me, she's never really retired, from the University of Toronto. She's the co-director of the International Reproductive and Sexual Health Law Program. But that's to understate her impact on this field. It's not just the field of feminist jurisprudence, not just the field of women's rights, but transnationally. So when I was thinking, okay, what can I read in the little short breaks during this conference, I brought one of her books because it's just perfect for the occasion, Abortion Law and Transnational Perspective, which is, as you know, probably now a bestseller. You're probably doing very well on royalties, Rebecca. So I'll be very brief because we are very short on time. She is so many things: the legal and ethical issues co-editor of the International Journal of Gynecology and Obstetrics. She serves on the editorial advisory board of the Human Rights Quarterly, and her published books include not just the one that I just indicated, Human Rights of Women, National and International Perspectives, way back in 1994, Gender Stereotyping, Transnational Legal Perspectives from 2010. She has won all sorts of awards, the Order of Canada, Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, etc. Her forthcoming book, I've had the chance to glance at a number of the chapters. It's a prize winner, even in advance of publication. It's called Frontiers of Gender Equality, and it has an all-star cast. So I give you the all-star, Rebecca Cook.
Thank you, Jose. And my thanks to the organizers of this timely dialogue, and my congratulations to the speakers for their extraordinarily rich presentations addressing these complex challenges of framing and implementing laws and policies to ensure women's equality, especially in East Asian countries. So what I want to do in my closing remarks is to raise some questions. And I do so with the hope that it sets out some stepping stones, some building blocks, that some versions of all of these presentations will be published in AJIL Unbound. Now, I'm tossing the challenge back to Jose because he had or did found AJIL. And I know my colleague Karen Knopf was devoted to AJIL Unbound and making it the journal that it is today. Why this is such an important journal is Jose, over his career, has done so much to democratize the field of international law generally. And it's brought different voices into international law through AJIL. And I hope you will see to it that these presentations see the light of day in AJIL Unbound, building on the most recent and illuminating version of AJIL on looking at the feminist approaches to international law, and the recent version of AJIL on the Latin American human rights system. Both of these editions are extremely important to growing both the development of international human rights law in Latin America and growing feminist approaches to international law. So my three questions, and I'm not concluding, I'm just raising some questions as steps towards way forward. So what have we learned about the gendered harms and how different sites, including the CEDAW committee, has made such harms visible and legally cognizable as forms of discrimination? My second question is, what have we learned about the interaction of international and national law as part of the transnationalization of gender equality rights, or the ecosystem of equality rights? Finally, what have we learned about the human, legal, and power dynamics surrounding women's rights and how they interact across national boundaries, races, religions, and socioeconomic classes? I really share the views of the last speakers, especially with regard to how the backlash against gender equality. And I have spent the past 5 years of my life working on the frontiers of gender equality, because it was my feeling after presenting many, many amicus briefs in different courts around the world on reproductive rights, trying to argue substantive equality and been consistently rejected by those courts, that we have to do far more to vernacularize gender equality. It's an ideal, but there's so much more we have to do to reduce that ideal to reality. So let me start with my first question. What have we learned about gendered harms in the different forums, including the CEDAW committee, and how such harms have been made visible and legally cognizable as forms of discrimination? From this book, I've learned about the case of Vishaka in India. I really think this is the high water mark of reducing the norm of gender equality domestically through the Indian Supreme Court. But it's not just the reduction of that ideal to establish sexual harassment as a form of discrimination. It's how they did it and how it was litigated and how it was argued. And this is through the work of Naina Kapoor, who is a chapter in my forthcoming book. So she explains that lawyering for equality required her to make visible and justiciable the larger dynamic of working women's vulnerability to sexual harassment and the huge equality costs incurred when workplace structures fail. As you recall, this is a case about a low-caste woman who was gang raped by men of a higher class in retaliation for her role as a change agent employed in a women's development program to empower women and girls. So Naina took General Recommendation 19 on violence against women of CEDAW, and India had just recently ratified the CEDAW Convention. She took General Recommendation 19 and argued that they had to fill a gap in Indian law and apply General Recommendation 19 to hold these people accountable and fill the gap. That decision was was done so well, and General Recommendation 19 was written with such clarity and such pervasiveness that the Supreme Courts of Bangladesh and Nepal followed suit. That's a very, very significant achievement. And yes, we have lots to be fearful of in 2022, but we do have lots to be proud of, and that certainly is one. Now, another very significant decision of CEDAW is the Lean de Silva Pimentel Teixeira decision of the Committee Against Brazil. It held Brazil responsible for the preventable death in childbirth of an Afro-Brazilian woman. The CEDAW committee explained that it said that in order to achieve equality in the field of healthcare, CEDAW requires states to accommodate not only sex-distinctive healthcare needs, but also distinctive healthcare needs of subgroups of women. So that was its really first decision on intersectionality, and it's had, as a result, had subsequent very important decisions. All of this is explained in the second edition of the CEDAW commentary, which should be out. I think it's actually being launched at a CEDAW meeting that's taking place now in Geneva, I believe. So the second edition of the CEDAW commentary, which is far better than the first edition, and I, as a co-author of one of the chapters, say that because the collective effort, and it's an edited volume, of the chapter authors for the second edition was significantly better overall. And it was really very reassuring to see the development of the jurisprudence in, I think it was about 15 years between the first and second edition. Now, beyond gender-based violence and preventable maternal mortality, the CEDAW committee has done a remarkable job in many ways in rendering invisible forms of subordination, For example, with respect to General Recommendation 37 on gender-related dimensions of climate change. As Shreya Attry has explained in her chapter of a book called Feminist Frontiers of Climate Justice, General Recommendation 37 has provided legal vocabularies on intersectional forms of discrimination of climate change that help women who have been so harmed to imagine that the vindications of their rights is even possible. Now, obviously, much more needs to be done to make other forms of discrimination against women possible. At this meeting, we've heard about food insecurity and many other inchoate, invisible forms or indirect forms of discrimination against women. So there's much to be done, but yet there's much to be proud of. Now, the particular areas that we've focused, that have been the focus of this particular meeting, makes us think about how can we accelerate some of these claims of emerging forms of gender discrimination. Many forms of discrimination are very camouflaged. Some are overt, such as the requirements of spousal authorization. But many forms are still very camouflaged. Whether they're camouflaged, as has been explained in Taiwan, in eugenic nationalism or population policies or pro-birth policies, or as has been explained in China about no sexuality education and how that disproportionately can impact on young girls. What was tremendously interesting, I thought, was the local research that's being done in China on how men are bringing cases against women for having abortions or miscarriages. And what I'm wondering is whether we need a far more robust approach to judicial education, such as been done through the Asia Pacific Forum on Judicial Education on Equality. Courts might be a real source, a real site for reinforcing patriarchy. And I will be fascinated to see the outcome of this research done on court decisions in China. In Korea, in South Korea, I was very encouraged to hear about the decision of the South Korean Apex Court legalizing abortion on grounds of autonomy and privacy. But I still wonder why the court didn't go for substantive equality. Is that because the CEDAW General Recommendation 24 on substantive equality is not clearly written, isn't persuasive? Do we need a rewrite of that General Recommendation 24 so it's as persuasive as General Recommendation 19 on violence against women? In the US, we see a real misuse of the history concerning the 14th Amendment and how that was used in the US Supreme Court decision in Dobbs. So yes, there are many issues that we need to focus in on, but there are some that we can build upon, and build upon we must. So the second question I have is, what have we learned about the interaction of international law as elaborated under many international treaties, but especially the CEDAW Convention or other norms, such as through the UN Committee, the Working Group on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women? The interaction between those norms and national law as elaborated by apex courts of Asian countries as part of a transnationalization of gender equality rights. Some trends are emerging, such as the constitutionalization of equality rights, where courts are borrowing from each other, east-west, and to some extent, north-south, to solve pressing problems that are often facilitated by the convening of judges, such as through the Asia Pacific Forum on Equality Education for Judges, or through, for example, the South-South collaboration, as was mentioned, on climate justice. A trend with the transnationalization of rights might be seen in the standard-setting functions of the UN specialized agencies, where such agencies adopt technical standards, and then they are adopted by the CEDAW committee or other committee as legal standards, legitimizing and legalizing them in international law. I've mentioned the World Health Organization Abortion Care Guidelines of 2022, but at least 10 years of work went into that guideline. And it was there were other guidelines that were set out even 20 years ago. This is an extraordinary document. It's set, I haven't really counted, but it has influenced healthcare guidelines around the world. And I'm wondering whether this might be a very important path forward. Similarly, in the Brazil case, the case against Brazil, you have the monitoring of emergency obstetric care, that handbook, which set the technical standard, which then the CEDAW committee adopted and made it its legal standard. Now, this is not just unique to the area of healthcare. You see it all throughout international law, where you have technical agencies developing standards, and then they're legalized and legitimized. And maybe this is all we can expect of the UN agencies. They do it, and they do it extremely well. So we shouldn't forget that incredibly important structure. Now it gets messy, really messy with regard to other issues. And sometimes CEDAW does it well, sometimes it doesn't do it well. For example, if you look at the domestic violence cases, they have had a clarion call for looking at domestic violence as a form of discrimination. But the jurisprudence falls apart when you look at the cases concerning the refoulement, the returning of refugee asylum-seeking women to their countries. Their record is somewhat embarrassing. And perhaps that is because the refugee context is far messier, far more difficult to deal with, and perhaps many more biases and stigma associated with it. So what about approaches? So that maybe the UN can only do certain things. Maybe CEDAW can only do other things. So what about bottom up? I don't like the word bottom up, bubbling up. We need something better. But you've seen instances, for example, of what they're doing in Taiwan. I love it. They're just adopting CEDAW and proceeding as though it was an international treaty. They're being creative. They're really out there. They've got lots of chutzpah. And that is something that we need to look at. Look at the bottom-up work in Hong Kong. Look at the bottom-up work perhaps through some of the national human rights commissions, such as in South Korea. So there are other spaces of resistance, and we do need much more work on what these other spaces of resistance are. The third world approaches to international law, all of their work, the South-to-South approach. How has the third world, does that research, does that work on third world approaches to international law have lessons for where we go with women's gender equality? Cities for CEDAW in the US. There's so many other ways of resistance. And here in the US, in Mexico, in Brazil, where particularly in Brazil, where I think you really do have a movement like in the US that life begins from the moment of conception, and you have Bolsonaro, or the Bolsonaro effect. Women in Brazil, women in the US, watch them. They are doing things with the abortion pill that's going to be the marvel of us all. I only know a fraction of some of those movements, but they're impressive. They're out there, they're at the edge, they're moving. They're fed up, and they're going to use their own norms, and they're going to really go all out to ensure that women get access to those pills. And some of those conversations are incredibly energizing. So what have we learned about human and legal and power dynamics surrounding women's rights in Asia and how they interact across national boundaries, races, religions, and socioeconomic classes? My third question. There are many modes of socializing, acculturating, vernacularizing, to use Sally Engelmary's work, of gender equality norms into the social fabric of communities of all countries, and how Asian feminist movements are using them. Are these modes more effective in generating compliance with gender equality rights, or in devising remedial measures that might be more effective in addressing the structural nature of discrimination? Where is the forward, as was put in a previous speaker? I love that term. Where is the forward? We need a balance between the local, well, maybe not a balance, but we need to think about how best to use the local, the regional, and the global. And maybe Fisuki's book, International Conflict Feminism, will give us some clues. The modes of resistance of feminist Asian movements have been cited here, especially against neo-authoritarianism and gender backlash. What are the distinctly Asian forms of discriminatory categorizations, prejudices, stereotypes, and biases that need resistance? And can they be reflected in the drafting of this forthcoming CEDAW commentary on stereotypes, prejudices, and biases? This is a very significant opportunity. I know CEDAW has been working on this idea for many years, and I'm thrilled that they are going to proceed. They have it now on their agenda to draft this general recommendation. It's a very significant opportunity to name not only, as been suggested, those prejudices, biases, and stereotypes in the AI, but also let's look at some of those stereotypes, prejudices, and biases that are reflected in religious doctrine, which has too often been overlooked for many, many reasons. But I think the CEDAW committee has the guts and the courage to face that. Is the resistance through the rewriting of court judgments? These projects that are swirling the world, popping up like mushrooms, such as the one currently being undertaken in India, effective in explaining how courts have missed opportunities to elaborate substantive or even transformative forms of gender equality. The rewriting projects, yes, they're focused quite narrowly on courts, but they have been already transformative in such significant ways. Just to give you one example, the rewriting of the McGee case in Ireland was rewritten brilliantly in the rewriting project of Northern Ireland. And in the McGee case, Mrs. McGee, a wife of a fisherman, claimed the right of privacy and claimed her right of conscience in trying to get access to contraception. She, as a married woman, had high blood pressure and she needed contraception. The court threw out her claim on the right of conscience, just tossed it out. They did decide for her on the right of privacy. But let's pause for a moment to think, what would have happened had that court way back in the 1970s given Mrs. McGee her right of conscience? Right now, the right of conscience is monopolized by doctors, their rights of conscientious objection, like women have no rights of conscience. But gladly, guess what? That rewritten decision, the feminist movements made sure that the right of conscience was argued before the Apex Court of Columbia. And the Apex Court of Columbia earlier this year gave women their right of conscience. So we have much to celebrate. Just think, Now women have their right of conscience. So the rewriting decisions, yes, they're very well done. They're very focused. And I think people in this room have been involved, or former speakers have been involved in rewriting projects here in the US. They can be incredibly persuasive, especially if you have a transnational women's movement that backs it up. So the Indian Rewriting Project, I think they've only produced one article. They're going to be published in the Indian Law Journal, and there's only one rewritten decision so far, but that's one to watch, and how the women's movement can pick up those rewritten decisions and use them in their advocacy. How do resistance movements apply different narratives, including narratives on decolonization or anti-imperialist feminists, to identify the more structural forms of discrimination, for example, by markets or religions, or has been suggested in the digital world? What are the Asian feminist movements doing to improve access to justice of the most marginalized? We know from the report on the UN Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor, making the law work for everybody, everyone, that the vast majority of people live without formal legal systems, under formal legal systems, or under legal systems that have been outdated. What are we doing to think together, to work together, to make some of these systems much more efficient? Yes, the UN Commission on the Legal Empowerment for the Poor has been long forgotten, but there's a lot of wisdom there that can be resurrected. Understanding, what have we done to better understand the actual local context and go and look at those particular forms of discrimination that are elaborated locally, and then bring them to the surface. Going from the bottom up, allowing much more to bubble up and not looking so much top down. Yes, we do have opportunities in the top down with the Sustainable Development Goal 5. But next year, we also have the opportunity of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So how can the bottom up begin to meet much more effectively with the top down to make these transnational women's movements far more effective? There are no easy answers to any of these questions. I raise them in hopes of fostering further dialogue among the legal communities in Asia and the United States on the interplay between domestic and international legal norms on gender equality, which I really do hope to see in AJIL Unbound, Jose. So thank you.
That concludes our conference, and alas, we don't have a second box lunch for all of you, but at least the panelists should gather up here for one final picture. Those panelists that remain, thank you all for staying through